So this is lecture 2 from a sustainability course. This is the final year sustainability course, and we are talking about different impacts of chemical industry on the environment. How do we take it into account in the design of chemical processes? And this specific lecture is about natural capital. We'll talk about the products of ecosphere which are considered in the human economy. We consider nature as natural capital, so materials and resources which are used in our industry, resources used in their creation and well-being. We need to talk about what is well-being. We will understand that the well-being is intricately linked with ecosystem, and the ecosystem or the ecosphere is then responsible for biotic regulation of the climate. And so this defines the links between the economy, the environment, the well-being of human beings, and the translation of the impacts of industry and the humans on the climate and the environment. So that's the context of this lecture. So if we look at the environment as natural capital first, traditionally chemical industry or any industry in society can be represented by this linear diagram. We take resources, which we consider high-quality materials. High quality is actually a thermodynamic term. We will look at it later in the course. We transform those resources into products within our society. We use those products. Eventually they become waste, and the wastes are then discarded into the environment. So if we look at the ecosphere, the products of ecosphere as natural capital, we can then see what kind of inputs we take from the environment. There are provisional services, which are basically the materials, food, fresh water, fuel, ornamental, genetic resources, and so on. There is regulation. This is the air quality, water quality, climate, soil fertility, and so on. This is also a service. And then there is cultural service, which is your spiritual and religious rights, the cultural diversity, the educational values, aesthetics, tourism, and so on. So then we can look at the more specific classification of the ecosystem services. So here on the left you see these three sections, the provisioning, regulation, and culture. Then you have different types, so biomass, genetics, regulation, specific activities such as outdoor interactions, and so on. And then on the right you have the different groups, how this is provided. So you have plants, you have aquatic plants, wild animals, and so on. And this grouping or this classification allows to dig deeper into the problem. So what goes into provisional services, what is linked in the environment with the regulation services, and what is linked with the cultural. So this classification is provided by the European Environmental Agency, and it's continuously being revised as we understand better how do we use the environment. We then try to classify this better, and this helps us to regulate what we are doing. So that's something about looking at nature as the resource. Now let me try to link it with the humans, the human side. And we typically talk about two things. One is the development, and the other one is well-being. And I kind of really like to talk about well-being more, but it's a bit tricky because it's a very fuzzy topic. So we start with the development. Development in society currently is being enumerated as a human development index. It combines health, education, and income as three categories. So the health is calculated as the life expectancy at birth. The education is enumerated as the mean of years of schooling for adults aged 25 or more, and expected years of schooling for children of school entering age. And the standard of living is a log of the gross national income per capita. And on the graph on the right, this is a little bit dated data up to 2014. you see the different countries with the different human development indices and how what is the gradient is in this index. What HDR does not reflect, it does not reflect inequality, it does not reflect poverty, human security, empowerment, and all of these other important factors which also enter into the well-being. So why is it important to talk about well-being? Well-being is how we define the aspirations of humans that eventually translate into societal behaviors, which eventually translate into demand for products, and that eventually translates into what we manufacture, and then how the manufacturing industries impact on the environment. And it becomes a closed cycle. You will see this. So the well-being for us depends on economics. So this is goods and services we have money to buy. Societal goods, which is we have jobs, we have education, we have intellectual capital, we have a legal system, the governance system, and the culture. Some of those have monetary values, such as jobs, and some of those do not have monetary values, such as culture. Although you can also monetize this. You can talk about access to culture, whether your museums are free, what's the price of tickets for the theater, what's access to theaters, and so on. And then there are ecological goods and services, which is your recreation in nature, access to beaches and so on, and the state of nature, which is important for the well-being of the people. Now, if you look at those categories, economic, societal, ecological, for the well-being, they kind of map on the natural capital categories, the regulation, the provision, and the cultural as well. So these things are very, very closely connected. So let's now try to see what the complication is and why I'm bringing those topics together in one system. Here is how they are integrated. We have natural capital, which provides natural resources. This goes into the economy. This is where we have our industry, we have production of materials and so on. Then we have society, where we talk about well-being, the aspirations and so on. And that requires the governance, the education, the institutions, which require the support of the technology and require the income from the technology. And then we have natural environment, which provides several kinds of services. It's supplying to the economy, it's supplying to the society in terms of cultural values, in terms of recreation and so on, but it's also the regeneration of the climate and the support of the climate. And so the core underlying problem of sustainability is that if those streams of services or the interactions are imbalanced, as they are imbalanced today, then we are going to have environmental problems and the climate change, which is a real problem today. So this is how everything is intricately connected in this topic. So when did we first realize that this is happening? The hypothesis which I've highlighted on the previous slide is that if we have an unconstrained use of resources, we are going to have a problem. And there are a couple of very important examples of this in the literature from the past of human society. The first reported case when someone have realized that the sustainability problem exists is this case of Royal Saxon Mining Department in 1713, when Hans Karl von Karlowitsch has realized that unconstrained logging in his region would lead to loss of income in the long term because there will be nothing to log. And so the only way his region would be able to prosper is by conquering other regions, which is not very nice if you are in the same country. So this gives us an equation that the rate of logging in the constrained territory, so when the area is constant, has to be lower than the rate of tree planting and growth. So that effectively is a very simple sustainability question for that particular industry. And then we know that if that is not fulfilled, then there are serious consequences. So some of the early examples is the complete loss of forestry in southern Lebanon and Syria, which then resulted in total change of climate and desertification of those regions. The same in the Mediterranean. In the early days of Christianity, the loss of forestry was led to erosion, loss of humus soil, and a very different landscape and a very different climate in those regions. But perhaps the most interesting example of the same and sort of similar timeline is this well-documented example of the Easter Island. So Easter Island was a Polynesian culture, and it was populated from the 5th century. It has poor soil, but it has a fairly small population. They have domesticated poultry, and the food in the region, because of the good climate, was relatively easy to come by. The society had plenty of resources, and the society started to have access. So there is time to do something else, and society started to develop more complex culture. So what we observe now is the remnants of this culture, these famous stone statues which are dotted around the coast. Those obviously required a lot of time and a lot of effort to do. They are massive structures, and in order to move them to their positions, trees were logged. They were making the structures to move the stones on logs to get them to the positions. They also cut the trees to allow more land for agriculture, but the land is not very fertile, so you need more and more land. And eventually they run out of trees. If you run out of trees and you freed up your land is then open to erosion. And after a few decades, your land is no longer fertile, and you can't produce your basic food, and then civilization collapses. You no longer have access in food, you're starving, the numbers of population go down, and the culture is no longer effectively relevant. So this is one of the, again, very well documented examples of constrained resources and unsustainable use of constrained resources. Now, where does it really lead into problems is when, on the scale of a planet, so on the scale of an island, it's very easy to see because the timeline is very short. Now, if we go on the scale of the planet, the resources are much more plentiful, so the timeline is different. So it's going to take longer to notice the limiting resources and the effects. And that's one of the reasons why we're acting so late. The real problem is that as we are affecting the resources, and some of them are resources which regulate the climate, then we are causing massive transformations in the climatic system, which then affect our ability to access natural resources. And so that will have very negative economic consequences. So what are the mechanisms we are beginning to affect? There are temperature gradients, which are important for wind and wind power. There is a rotation of the planet, which is there. There is gravitational pull of moon, which changes the water movement. There are water currents, which we are beginning to affect. There is atmosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere interactions, which we are beginning to affect. And there is the interaction of biosphere with the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. And this is the one I'm really wanted to talk about now, because that's the one which is very critical for a climate change. So let's talk about these different elements. We know that there are cyclic processes in the planet. There is a water cycle, there is carbon cycle, and so on. So what is water cycle? Ocean occupies most of the land. Ocean contains a lot of water. It's a very large thermal reservoir. And effectively, the water storage and water cover of the planet is responsible for the maintenance of the temperature on the planet. Over the millions of years, the planet temperature was more or less stable within a fairly narrow range. And of course, the narrower that range, the more stable is the climate. This +5, +25 is too broad range, so there will be massive changes of the climate. We've been living in a much, much more stable temperature regime for the last several tens of thousands of years. Where water is important is maintenance of temperature through just sheer amount of water, but also through the glaciers, and I'll mention it in a minute. So this is kind of a graphical representation of the water cycle on the planet. Most of the water is in oceans and seas. That's where we see the major water cycle. This is evaporation and precipitation over the oceans. As you can see from the numbers, this is imbalanced. So some of the evaporated water is moved over land, and then it's a precipitation over mountains, precipitation over areas which are more flat, over forests and so on. And then the water is returned into oceans and rivers, the aquifers, through the transport through land, effectively creating your ground water table. Where water is also very important is when water cycles are interacting very closely with the environment on the shore regions. This is a relatively complicated diagram, but it shows different types of interactions depending whether ocean is connected to the desert, ocean is connected to land but not desert, and then ocean connected to forests. And the presence of forest next to in the ocean creates an additional water flux. This is so-called biotic pump of atmospheric moisture. It changes the direction of flow of water in that region. If you don't have the forest next to the ocean, then you only have the movement of moisture back to the ocean, and effectively that maintains the dryness of the area next to the ocean. That's why there are many desert areas close to the water, particularly in the warmer climates. However, if you have natural forest sitting next to the ocean, what happens is that the forest effectively works as a pump. You have the water going through the plants into the leaves. There is a different microclimate underneath the forest canopy that is moved further into land. This water evaporates far further away from the land, from the shoreline, and that's pumping of this water inland creates a very different climate and very different micro environment. That's why it's really important to retain those forests. In all of the areas where those forests next to oceans were cut down, the climate has changed, and it's very difficult to come back. The residence time of water in different reservoirs makes also a big difference. So we now know a lot about this, how water is exchanged in the biosphere, how water is exchanged in the atmosphere, in rivers and so on. This makes sense to understand when we're talking about the global cycles, the cycles of nutrients, the impact of industry, whether we're talking about impact on rivers or lakes or oceans and so on. This latency of the exchange of molecules is important because we then can project when can we see the consequences of some of our actions. The other major cycle, which we are very well aware of, is the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is more complex. You have the majority of carbon reservoirs is in marine sediments and the ocean sedimental rocks. That's where most of carbon is stored. This is millions of years of biology in the ocean, microorganisms capturing carbon and storing it eventually in the sediments, as well as the natural chemistry which creates the carbonates which are sedimenting. Now you have the in-ocean cycles, and there are two. There is a deep exchange between the deep water and the shallow water. There's different salinity ranges, different densities, different temperatures, and so those two regions are separated. And then there is a surface water cycle, which then has an interaction with the atmosphere. Those two cycles are different, and they're also slightly imbalanced. And the imbalance is connected with the marine life. Is where are the organisms, where are the mineralization processes happen, and where the captured carbon by organisms and by chemistry in the ocean then translates into sediments which then drop into the ocean. We already saw that there is the exchange in water above oceans, there is exchange in carbon, which is actually very well balanced above the oceans. There is another big cycle, which is plant growth and plant decay, which is not balanced. There is a lot more carbon going into the plants than carbon coming out of the plants. And that is one of the major carbon storage mechanisms on the planet. We quite often forget about this. Now, this is kind of balanced by the soil degradation, so the biology in the soil, which then removes the carbon back into the atmosphere, the green line. So together the plant growth decay and the soil organic matter release are kind of balanced, but there is different timeline. There is timeline for capturing carbon in the plants, and there is a different timeline for degradation and release. So there are lags in those scales. And where you see the entire system, it's kind of very well balanced. The only thing which is imbalanced is the release through fossil fuel use. And this is anthropogenic use of carbon, which is stored in oil, gas, and coal. The number, if you can see on this picture, is not that high compared to the numbers in the cycles. So the question arises, how can this small release of carbon, which is imbalanced with other cycles, be so influential? And this is where we begin to understand that the climatic system is actually extremely finely balanced. And disruption of that climatic system, even by relatively small but constant flux and increasing flux of this carbon, which is imbalanced by anything else, is a huge problem. We can expect that the biota will respond and the natural environment will start capturing more carbon, but it's not necessarily happening at the required speed. And there are also additional factors such as acidification of ocean, reduction of the productivity of the biota in the ocean, and so on. Now, the two things which are linked, the water cycle and the carbon cycle, are kind of linked through this greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is the reflection of sun radiation by the planetary surface and by the cloud cover and the atmospheric gases in the atmosphere. The greenhouse gases are not allowing the infrared radiation to leave the atmosphere, and in this case the atmosphere heats up. Now, this is related to two things. One is which gases are in the atmosphere. Water, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and other gases are very potent infrared mirrors, and they don't allow the infrared radiation to leave. And the surface of the planet is very important in terms of how much light is being sent back, so how much of this infrared radiation is sent back. So ice cover is very important. This is where you have the highest reflection. Tree cover is much worse reflection, and it also depends on which kind of trees. So this is becoming a rather complex interaction. You want the tree cover to capture the carbon, at the same time, it actually reduces the reflectivity of the surface. So you have more of the infrared radiation on the surface, but then it links with the cycle of carbon. So this is how the climatic models are becoming really quite complex because of the interactions. So finally, we talk about the other species in the regulation of the environment. We talked about water, we talked about carbon dioxide, but we have other cycles, and we can distinguish between locally and globally regulated chemical species. The locally regulated species are such as phosphorus. Phosphorus is phosphorus and a little bit nitrogen in the surface. So how do we define those things? We can look at the production, so fluxes of a chemical in and out of the matter, of the biological matter, production and destruction. And we can look at the physical fluxes, which is wind, convection through water, for example, convection through soil, and we can define it by diffusion coefficient, let's say, which covers everything. Now, a substance is called locally regulated if its biological flux is similar to the physical flux or larger. If the physical flux is much larger than the biological flux, then it's not a locally regulated chemical. So what are the global and local regulated chemicals? The globally regulated chemicals is something like carbon. Carbon is not locally regulated. It's regulated by the size of the entire system. The physical fluxes of carbon are massively bigger than the biological fluxes of carbon. But on the local range, on the local area, you can actually see that the fluxes of carbon are actually quite important. There are also some unregulated species. So, for example, oxygen. There is just so much oxygen in the atmosphere that you can't really regulate it by any mechanisms in the environment. So, this is the end of the material, and let me just highlight what is the learning from this. What did we learn from looking at these three different aspects? In the human economy, we tend to consider nature as ecological services. This is a very human-centric look at nature. We look at nature as capital. Natural capital is a very popular term in economics because natural capital supports economic activities, it supports human development. It is linked with the Human Development Index. The more resources you have, the better the economy you have. That translates into your incomes and so on. However, we also understand that HDI, Human Development Index, does not consider many of the factors which are very important for sustainability, such as inequality, poverty, security, empowerment, and so on. What is not accounted in the concept of natural capital is the role of biota in the regulation of the environment. That aspect is not easily accounted for. There is that regulational function. We understand that it's there, but we don't cost it. And so then our decision-making process is lightly skewed economically. Whereas for sustainability, we really need to balance this decision-making and understand much, much harder in much better numbers what is the impact on transforming the regulatory functions of the climate, of the ecosystem, and how do we change the manufacturing processes that we eliminate those transformations.